How do we think about the trade-offs between the mission scope? If we think about Sean's example just now of what's in the policy document versus what's in the budget document, inherently there are a set of trade-offs. And so there would be with any new vessel and the set of capabilities that it might need to have. But again, there will be lots of different interests. All of those interests have motivations and preferences for more or fewer of those, of what that mission is going to be. Then we look at, the most important group, the users themselves and what they'll be able to do with it. We look at the degree to which it'll be interoperable with not only other Coast Guard assets, both maritime and avionic, but also how it might operate with other U.S. naval vessels, and in addition, some of the National Science Foundation investments as well. We then look at this issue of fielding time and agility, and we recognize, like so much of the conversation over the past 2 days, about the dynamic and changing environment in the Arctic, and therefore the capabilities themselves might have to not only change, but evolve more quickly to be able to do so. And so that often brings up the issue of life cycle costs. It's not just procuring this for $1 billion. It's also the operations and maintenance. It's also the crewing. It's also the home porting. It's also putting it in dry dock and doing the updates. It's the parts. If you ask any coastie, one of the real banes of their existence is just getting parts. And perhaps there's no federal agency that is more innovative and creative with duct tape, wire, and chewing gum than the United States Coast Guard, and being able to make a lot of their assets function well beyond what would be a normal lifespan. So life cycle costs are an important element, but so are budgetary considerations. We heard yesterday a lot of conversation about the federal government and thinking about procurement regulations, but also about the notorious scoring criteria within the Office of Management and Budget. So again, are there ways to think about this differently? Would there need to be new laws and regulations, and how might we think about those? And finally, the question for each and every one of us in this room, what's the value for money to the taxpayer? What is it that we're going to get as a result of making this kind of investment? So we looked at four alternatives, but first I just sort of want to highlight a little bit of the traditional approach that's currently being used. As you can see in this traditional procurement approach, and the Polar Star is a classic example, there's one acquirer. They bought it new at the time. The vessel itself is capable of multiple missions. And there are some real advantages to that. When you think about the complex set of mission responsibilities of the Coast Guard and that scope, the users themselves are largely satisfied with the asset and its capabilities. It is, in fact, able to operate with a lot of the existing Coast Guard assets. It's becoming more difficult to be interoperable with some of the newer Coast Guard assets and some of the newer naval assets. And so there was no statutory issue with this, because this is the way the government has always procured both goods and services. But there are some drawbacks to this approach, and some of those we've already touched on in terms of time, cost, agility, flexibility, the budgetary considerations, and how we might think of broader life cycle cost approaches. So are there other things that we can do? The Coast Guard is going through the largest asset recapitalization investment in its history. And the integrated Coast Guard system was an approach that was introduced in the late 90s, and the Coast Guard has used several different approaches, but as you can see in the pictures in front of you, these are just two of the more recent assets that they've procured. One of their most complex one, not shown here, is something called the National Security Cutter, of which they hope to procure a total of 9. But the Fast Response Cutter, the picture at the bottom, has been a very successful acquisition for the Coast Guard, using a traditional patent design, a design used by other countries, but they're also getting ready to pursue an acquisition for something called the Offshore Patrol Cutter. So the question here is, could we retrofit one of these new assets where there's already a production environment that's been developed, where a lot of the requirements determination has already happened, where a lot of the technical feasibility elements have been worked out, both within the Coast Guard, with OMB, and with its broader stakeholder community, both on the congressional side as well as within the Department of Homeland Security. Could we take this kind of an approach and think about an existing asset and some opportunities to bring it into this new environment to help augment where there's currently a deficit of capabilities? And again, there are some pros to this from a technical feasibility perspective, from a life cycle perspective, but there are some challenges too. Like everything, you can't have everything you want without increasing the costs and the schedule. So there are some trade-offs here on scope and what the Coast Guard might be able to do with something like the Fast Response Cutter or even something like the National Security Cutter if these were in fact retrofitted to have an ice-breaking capability. And that then brings into question whether the Coast Guard's agility, its ability to immediately adapt to a changing environment, would be strengthened by this approach, whether it be kind of neutral with this approach, or whether it would actually be set back with this approach. And so that's some of what we look at in our analysis to think about, would that work? From a value for money perspective, the first thing that everyone on an authorization and appropriations committee is always concerned about, look, this may not be cheaper. If anything, we may end up getting into problems of gold plating and adding more requirements onto a ship that then doesn't have an easy plug and play and interoperability dimension. So there are some considerations with that as well. Lease charter, this is an option that, as I suggested before, several other federal agencies have used, both in a national security environment as well as, the scientific environment, thinking about broader dynamic operational capabilities and situational awareness. There are some real strengths of this approach. It creates a lot more agility and flexibility in terms of, being able to immediately go to the private sector and say, there are a range of things that we need, or there is one thing that we need, and that one thing is the ability to break ice in these kind of environments with this set of criteria. Now, of course, what that does is it forces the private sector appropriately to bear a certain proportion of risk. And there are no shortage of shipbuilding enterprises that could in fact build icebreaker vessels. But again, at the end of the day, when you ask people the value for money question, there is a lot of concern that, okay, we lease an icebreaker from company X for a period over 10 years, and at the end of 10 years, we own nothing. It's basically like renting an apartment, right? We don't own that at the end of the 10 years. Now, some might argue that the advantage is we don't have then sunk costs into a design of a capability, into an asset that no longer has the functionality and dynamic responsiveness we need to a changing operating environment. But again, the restriction is if we had taken the money we spent on leasing and actually invested it into an asset itself, the Coast Guard, perhaps more than anything, any other federal agency, is often seen as a frugal owner. They can extend the life of this not just from 10 years, but oftentimes to 30 and 40 years. And so that becomes one of the big questions. And the largest sticking point on the lease charter is this whole idea of statutory permissibility in the budget process, in really thinking about you have to have up front all the money for the length of the lease in a single budget year. Often viewed as a constraint, but as we suggested before, and as Sean highlighted at the beginning of his talk, there are examples where other federal agencies have been able to create alternatives to that approach, and even in the most recent language, there is a real softening by the federal government toward this as a potential alternative. There is also the ability to think about entering into binational partnerships. And as we heard yesterday, strong relationships with the Canadian government, strong relationships increasingly because of forums like this and the relationships by a number of you with other Arctic nations. And so could there be an approach where the United States government either jointly enters into an agreement with the Canadian Coast Guard to buy an icebreaker vessel that has shared governance responsibilities and authority, or could it be that the United States Coast Guard could procure an icebreaker from the Canadian government where there's already an established design, where there's already an established production environment, and where we already have a good sense of both the costs, the advantages of the vessel, and some of the limitations relative to the mission scope trade-offs that we, the United States government, and specifically the United States Coast Guard, might have real concerns over. And so again, this presents a real and viable alternative, and certainly it helps alleviate the idea that we would somehow be buying from allies that we are not quite in good relationships with. The relationship with the Canadian government is quite strong, but here I think what you see is that there is a real mix in terms of what we would get on the asset side in terms of mission capabilities relative to some of the trade-offs that we might give up by using someone else's design. And then finally, there's been a lot of conversation here about public-private partnerships. And while public-private partnerships are not new and have been used around the globe in a number of countries, the United States comes to the issue of PPP quite late relative to most other nations. In the United States, we have very limited enabling legislation around public-private partnerships, and so any attempt to use PPPs often, perhaps too often, feels like we're sort of reinventing the wheel, even though there's significant guidance and frameworks that are used in lots of other infrastructure investment areas. Here, we might be thinking about not just the United States Coast Guard, but we might be thinking about the United States Navy, NOAA, the National Science Foundation, and again, having shared responsibilities in terms of joint investment approaches, something that may have a more attractive element in terms of a whole of government orientation, but at the same time, one of the real limitations is it might lend itself to mission and scope creep, where everyone wants their own kind of requirements, and it begins to get to the stage where it becomes very expensive, very hard to move forward, and as a number of you have said today without actually saying this, too often perfect becomes the enemy of the good, and the quest for a 100% solution often undermines the broad technical feasibility and implementability of an 85% solution. If we could think about an 85 or 90% solution with a broader intragovernmental partnership, there are a number of federal stakeholders that might have real interest. But as we suggest, this is itself, while valuable and has some real advantages, not without its own limitations. One of the things that we did here purposefully is to try to offer alternatives using an analytical framework to generate dialogue and discussion. So what you see in front of you is we've made no judgments in terms of which of these options is a better option across some set of criteria. Now, what we've done is simply to put a check or an X where we thought that there may be some natural advantage or limitation associated with one of these alternatives relative to the 9 criteria that we set forth. Obviously, any real effort, you might decide to say, well, let's use a 1 to 5, where 1 is least important and 5 is most important. You might decide to score these criteria equally. You might decide to weight these criteria in terms of priority. I think as Mr. Treadwell has said, a number of the speakers have said, and Sean certainly articulated, the real challenge when thinking about alternatives is what you prioritize. And everything, by necessity, cannot be a priority. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so here we sort of lay these out, really hoping that this is an input to a broader discussion about how would we prioritize. What is the most important? What is the second important? How would we score these? And again, we might all score these quite differently depending on where we sit. But at the end of the day, icebreaker capabilities are a critical input and set of activities to being able to achieve the larger desirable policy and economic objectives associated with Arctic infrastructure investment. So what we've done here is simply to lay that out as a first step. Now I know that we're a little bit tight on time here, so I'll just summarize by saying that when we think about this issue, right? Acquiring icebreakers is increasingly not just a Coast Guard issue, not an Alaskan issue, not an Arctic issue. It is a national security issue. And I think sometimes it's easy to see that element of a national orientation lost in a lot of the kind of congressional and political discussions about what is the Coast Guard going to do. These are national issues. But I think it would be fair to say that traditional procurement might not be the best approach to being able to acquire new icebreaking capabilities within the Arctic, especially from the U.S.'s perspective in terms of its objectives, broadly defined. And so what we've tried to do here is to say, you know, there are alternatives. Not all missions are equally important. Not all missions have kind of a necessarily governmental element to them. There may be some missions which are not exclusively inherently governmental, and ice breaking itself might be one of those. So I think this is where we wanted to offer a set of alternatives to help generate dialogue and debate and hopefully move forward to a better solution. Thank you very much.